The morning sun broke across the Pacific waters in March of 1943, its golden rays dancing upon waves that seemed peaceful enough to lull anyone into a false sense of security. Beneath that deceptive calm, currents moved with purpose, carrying 8 heavily laden vessels toward what their commanders believed would be just another routine crossing. Standing on the command deck of the transport vessel Kios Maru, a Japanese colonel by the name of Tishi Nakamura gazed outward at the expanse of blue stretching to every horizon, his experienced eyes searching for threats that he was certain would never materialize. The convoy he traveled with represented more than just ships and cargo. It was the embodiment of Japan's determination to hold the scattered islands and jungle fortresses that formed the outer edges of their Pacific empire. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers had been packed into the holds of these transports, men who stood shoulder to shoulder in cramped quarters, their equipment stacked around them, their thoughts focused on the battles that awaited them once they reached the shores of New Guinea. The protective screen of destroyers that surrounded this precious cargo bristled with weaponry designed to repel any attack from the skies, their crews trained and confident in their ability to shoot down any bomber foolish enough to venture within range of their guns. Everything about this voyage suggested routine, safety, and the overwhelming superiority that Japan had grown accustomed to projecting across these waters. Yet hundreds of miles away from this scene of apparent tranquility, something entirely different was taking shape. On airfields scattered across Australia and the captured territories that the Allies still clung to with desperate determination, aircraft engines were being coaxed to life with careful attention from mechanics who understood that every bolt, every wire, every drop of oil might mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. These weren't ordinary preparations for an ordinary bombing run. The men working on these aircraft, loading ammunition belts that seemed to stretch endlessly across tarmac surfaces baked hard by tropical sun, knew they were part of something unprecedented, something that would either revolutionize aerial warfare or prove to be a spectacular and deadly miscalculation. Pilots gathered in briefing rooms where crude maps showed the projected course of the Japanese convoy, studying approach angles and timing with an intensity that spoke to their understanding of just how dangerous their assigned task would be. What was being planned defied nearly every principle of conventional bombing doctrine, abandoning the safety of altitude for the terrifying vulnerability of wave-top attacks, trading the theoretical precision of high-level bombing for the brutal certainty of point-blank engagement. The aircraft themselves had been transformed into something that their original designers would scarcely recognize. The B-25 Mitchell medium bomber, conceived and built as a platform for delivering explosives from comfortable distances and respectable heights, had undergone a metamorphosis that turned it from a conventional aerial weapon into something far more predatory and immediate. The transparent nose sections where bombardiers normally crouched with their sophisticated sighting equipment had been stripped away, replaced with solid metal housings that accommodated not 1 or 2, but sometimes 8 heavy machine guns pointing forward like the fangs of some mechanical beast. These modifications had been born not in official research facilities or through formal military channels, but in the desperate improvisation of field workshops where men like Paul Gunn, a former naval aviator consumed by personal tragedy and burning with the need to strike back at an enemy who had taken everything from him, applied their grief and genius to reshaping the tools of war. Gunn himself had watched his family disappear into the nightmare of Japanese occupation in the Philippines, seen his old life consumed by a war that had swept across the Pacific with terrifying speed, and found himself left with nothing but his skills and an all-consuming drive for vengeance. When he looked at the B-25 Mitchell, he didn't see what it was designed to do. He saw what it could be made to do if someone had the audacity to rip out its conventional components and rebuild it according to a completely different philosophy. The fragile glass nose offended him, wasted space that could be filled with weapons. The bombardier position represented a bombing doctrine that had proven itself utterly inadequate against moving ships. Everything about the standard configuration seemed designed for a war that wasn't the one actually being fought in the Pacific. where Japanese convoys moved with impunity and where every failed attack meant more supplies reaching enemy garrisons, more reinforcements arriving to dig themselves into defensive positions, more lengthening of a conflict that was bleeding the Allies dry. Working alongside Jack Fox, a civilian representative from North American aviation who possessed both the technical knowledge and the willingness to bend official regulations in service of battlefield necessity, Gunn set about creating something entirely new. In workshops where heat made the metal almost too hot to touch and where the constant pressure of time weighed on every decision, mechanics stripped out equipment that had been installed by factory workers who had never imagined such modifications. Heavy mounting brackets were fabricated and installed to handle the recoil forces of multiple heavy machine guns firing simultaneously. Ammunition feeds were routed through spaces never intended to accommodate them, creating pathways that would allow thousands of rounds to flow into the weapons without jamming or interruption. Each 50 caliber machine gun added to these modified aircraft represented devastating firepower. Capable of spitting out nearly 800 rounds every minute, each bullet a chunk of metal and explosive core designed to punch through armor plate and flesh with equal ease. When 8 such weapons were mounted together and synchronized to fire as one, the effect was apocalyptic, creating a stream of projectiles that amounted to more than 6,000 rounds per minute, a volume of fire that exceeded what some naval vessels could produce. But firepower, however impressive, solved only part of the problem that had plagued Allied attempts to strike Japanese shipping. Major William Benn, commanding officer of the 63rd Bombardment Squadron, wrestled with the fundamental challenge that had turned so many previous attacks into expensive failures. Accuracy remained the central problem. The inescapable fact that bombs dropped from high altitude simply could not hit ships that had the freedom to maneuver across open water. He had witnessed the frustrating reality firsthand, watching through binoculars as stick after stick of bombs fell harmlessly into empty ocean, while their intended targets simply altered course and steamed away untouched. The mathematics were brutally simple. A ship traveling at 20 knots could cover hundreds of feet in the seconds it took for a bomb to fall from 20,000 feet, and ship captains who knew American bombers were overhead had plenty of time to throw their vessels into evasive turns that made hitting them an exercise in pure chance. Something fundamental had to change if aircraft were going to become effective anti-shipping weapons, and Ben found himself returning again and again to an idea that seemed almost childishly simple, yet impossibly dangerous. Skip bombing, the technique Ben began to develop and refine, drew its inspiration from the timeless pastime of throwing flat stones across pond surfaces and watching them ricochet in a series of diminishing bounces. The concept required reducing altitude to wave-top level, approaching the target at maximum speed to minimize exposure time, and releasing bombs at such close range that they would literally bounce across the water surface like those childhood stones before slamming into the hull of the target vessel. Everything about the technique violated conventional wisdom about bombing tactics. Flying at mast height meant exposing the aircraft to every weapon the enemy could bring to bear, from the largest anti-aircraft guns down to individual rifles fired by desperate sailors. The margin for error was measured in feet rather than hundreds of yards. A slight miscalculation in altitude or timing would either send the bomb plunging uselessly into the water or cause it to skip over the target entirely. Success and death existed in such close proximity that they could scarcely be distinguished until the moment of impact, and even then, an aircraft had to survive flying through the explosion of its own weapon if the timing went according to plan. The fusion of Gunn's heavily armed aircraft modifications with Ben's skip-bombing technique created something that existed outside any existing doctrine or tactical manual. Training for this new form of warfare consumed endless hours as crews practiced their approaches against hulks anchored in harbours, learning to judge their altitude by the spray their propellers kicked up from wave-tops, developing the instinctive timing that would tell them precisely when to release their weapons for maximum effect. The tactics evolved through trial and error, with one aircraft designated to sweep the target's deck with machine gun fire, systematically eliminating the anti-aircraft crews before they could bring their weapons to bear, while a second aircraft would follow immediately behind, using the confusion and devastation created by the first to press home its bombing attack with minimal interference. The ocean itself became a classroom where the price of mistakes could be measured in torn metal and lives lost to unforgiving waters, but gradually the crews began to master this brutal new form of combat, learning to work their aircraft like precision instruments rather than blunt objects. By the time the calendar turned to early 1943, workshops scattered across the Allied-held territories had produced dozens of these modified bombers, each one representing countless hours of labor by mechanics who understood they were creating something that might change the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. The variations were considerable, some aircraft mounting 4 forward-firing guns, others carrying 6, and a precious few equipped with the full battery of 8 weapons that turned them into flying arsenals of truly terrifying capability. Additional weapons sprouted from dorsal turrets, waist positions, and cheek mountings until the aircraft seemed to have guns pointing in virtually every direction, ready to engage targets regardless of their position relative to the bomber. The men assigned to fly these machines looked at them with a mixture of pride and apprehension, understanding that they were being given tools of unprecedented power, while also recognizing that employing those tools would require them to fly into the jaws of hell itself. Among the crews, whispered conversations compared the modified Mitchells to dragons, mythical beasts capable of breathing fire and destruction upon anything unfortunate enough to cross their path. Across the waters that separated the two forces, Japanese commanders remained blissfully ignorant of the transformation that had occurred in Allied capabilities. Their intelligence reports spoke of ineffective high-altitude attacks that had accomplished little beyond wasting fuel and ammunition, confirming their existing belief that American air power posed no serious threat to properly escorted convoys. The doctrine they had developed, based on traditional naval thinking and the theories of decisive battle that had been drilled into Japanese officers since their earliest training, assumed that destroyers and anti-aircraft defenses would provide adequate protection against anything the enemy might attempt. Ships moved in carefully planned formations designed to create overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that any attacking aircraft would have to run a gauntlet of weapons, no matter which approach angle it chose. Crews drilled endlessly on procedures for repelling air attacks, learning to track high-flying bombers and throw up walls of exploding shells designed to either destroy the attacking aircraft or force them to drop their weapons prematurely from altitudes where accuracy became impossible. The entire system was predicated on assumptions about how air attacks would be conducted, assumptions that were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The transformation extended beyond mere hardware and tactics, representing a fundamental shift in how the Allies thought about the relationship between air and naval power. For too long, the assumption had been that aircraft were supplementary to surface vessels, useful for reconnaissance and harassment, but incapable of decisive action against properly defended ships. The disasters that had befallen Allied forces earlier in the war, watching as Japanese fleets operated with near impunity while conventional bombing attacks failed to achieve meaningful results, had forced a painful re-evaluation of those assumptions. What emerged from that crucible of necessity was a new understanding that properly employed aircraft could not merely threaten ships but could dominate them, could turn vast expanses of ocean into killing grounds where traditional naval superiority meant nothing in the face of enemies that struck from the air with speed and precision that left no time for effective response. The workshops that had produced the modified bombers became symbols of resilience and innovation, proof that defeat could be transformed into determination, and that the side willing to abandon outdated thinking and embrace radical new approaches might seize advantages that doctrine alone could never provide. For the mechanics who had sweated through long days and sleepless nights to complete these modifications, there was a profound sense of accomplishment mixed with anxiety about whether their work would prove adequate when tested under actual combat conditions. They had taken aircraft fresh from factories designed around one set of assumptions and rebuilt them according to entirely different principles, improvising solutions to problems that no engineering manual addressed. creating something that existed nowhere in official specifications or authorized modifications. Every gun mount they had fabricated, every ammunition feed they had routed through cramped fuselages, every structural reinforcement they had added to handle the stresses of low-level flight and multiple heavy weapons, represented their contribution to a war effort that had seemed on the verge of collapse just months earlier. Now, as they watched crews pre-flight these transformed aircraft, checking the weapons that bristled from every angle, they could only hope that their ingenuity would prove sufficient when the moment of truth arrived. The psychological impact on the aircrews themselves was profound and complex. Pilots who had spent months conducting high-altitude attacks from relative safety now faced the prospect of taking their aircraft down to wave-top height, where every weapon the enemy possessed could engage them. Bombardiers, whose entire training had focused on the careful use of sophisticated sighting equipment, found themselves reassigned to other positions, their specialized skills made irrelevant by tactics that reduced bombing to an act of point-blank violence. Gunners understood that their weapons would be used not primarily for self-defense, but as offensive weapons designed to sweep enemy decks clean of life before bombs could be delivered. The entire psychology of aerial combat was shifting, moving away from the abstract calculus of high-altitude precision towards something far more visceral and immediate, where success would be measured in the ability to fly straight and level through walls of enemy fire while delivering weapons at ranges where the faces of enemy sailors would be clearly visible. As night settled over the scattered Allied airbases on March 2, 1943, the final preparations for the attack reached their conclusion. The Japanese convoy, still steaming southward through deteriorating weather that would soon clear into perfect visibility, remained unaware that they had become the focus of an attack that would employ tactics and weapons they had never encountered before. On both sides of the coming battle, men made their final preparations according to completely different sets of assumptions about how the engagement would unfold, and those differing assumptions would determine everything about what happened when the two forces finally collided in the waters of the Bismarck Sea. The darkness that wrapped itself around New Guinea's airfields on that March night carried with it a weight of anticipation that seemed almost physical in its intensity. Floodlights cast harsh pools of illumination across parking areas where B-25 Mitchells sat in neat rows, their modified noses pointing toward runways that would soon carry them toward their date with history. Mechanics moved among the aircraft with practiced efficiency, their hands performing final checks that had been rehearsed so many times they had become automatic. Yet tonight every action carried additional significance because everyone understood that the morning would bring something unprecedented. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with gun oil created a distinctive odor that permeated everything, seeping into clothing and equipment until it became impossible to escape the reminder of what was coming. Bombs hung beneath wings like deadly ornaments, their smooth casings reflecting the work lights as teams of ordnance handlers made final inspections of fusing mechanisms and release systems, knowing that mechanical failure at the critical moment could doom not just the mission but the crew depending on that weapon to complete their attack run. Inside wooden structures that served as briefing rooms, pilots and crew members crowded around tables covered with charts and reconnaissance photographs, their attention focused on grainy images that showed the Japanese convoy as it had appeared when last observed by Allied reconnaissance aircraft. Intelligence officers pointed out the various vessel types, identifying the transports that represented the primary targets and the destroyers that would provide the defensive screen any attacking aircraft would have to penetrate. The mission parameters were laid out in stark terms: low-level approaches at maximum speed, strafing runs to suppress anti-aircraft fire, skip-bombing attacks delivered from ranges that would put the attackers well within the effective engagement envelope of every weapon the enemy possessed. Questions were asked and answered, though everyone in the room understood that once the attack commenced, plans would give way to chaos and survival would depend on training, reflexes, and whatever measure of luck each crew carried with them into combat. The atmosphere throughout the base carried an almost sacred quality, as if everyone present understood they were witnesses to a moment that would be remembered long after the participants had passed into history. Conversations that normally filled the evening hours were muted, reduced to quiet exchanges between men who needed to say something to break the tension, but couldn't quite find words adequate to the situation. Cigarettes glowed like fireflies in the tropical darkness, small points of light that marked where nervous hands sought comfort in familiar rituals. A chaplain made his rounds through the assembled crews, offering words of encouragement and blessing to men who might not hold any particular religious faith, but found comfort in the ancient tradition of seeking divine favour before battle. Some wrote letters to family members back home, trying to compress complex emotions and uncertain futures into a few carefully chosen sentences that might serve as final communications if the morning went badly. Others cleaned weapons or checked equipment for the 100th time, finding reassurance in activities that gave their hands something to do while their minds wrestled with mortality and duty. Far out across the dark waters that separated the opposing forces, a very different scene was playing out aboard the vessels of the Japanese convoy. Colonel Nakamura shared a sparse meal with fellow officers in the cramped quarters of the Kios Maru. Their conversation focused on practical matters related to the unloading procedures they would follow once they reached Leh and the deployment of troops to reinforce positions that were growing increasingly desperate as Allied pressure continued to mount. Nobody aboard the convoy ships seriously entertained the possibility of disaster, their confidence built on a foundation of previous experience where American air attacks had proven ineffective and easily evaded. The destroyers circling the formation represented what seemed like overwhelming protective power, their crews drilled to standards that would allow them to engage multiple targets simultaneously while maintaining the careful formation discipline that Japanese naval doctrine emphasized. Officers discussed victory as though it were inevitable, as though the safe arrival of this convoy and its precious cargo of reinforcements would mark another step in the consolidation of Japan's Pacific Empire. The storm that had cloaked the convoy for the past 3 days was beginning to break apart, torn to pieces by changing weather patterns that would leave the Bismarck Sea under clear skies by morning. To Allied planners tracking the convoy's progress through reconnaissance reports and intelligence intercepts, this clearing weather represented a gift from whatever forces controlled such things, removing the last natural obstacle that might have prevented the attack from proceeding as planned. Confirmation of the convoy's position came through multiple sources, all agreeing that the Japanese ships were maintaining course and speed toward Leh, now less than 100 miles from their destination and well within range of the modified bombers waiting at their bases. The window of opportunity that had been carefully calculated and planned for was opening exactly as hoped, and orders went out to begin final launch preparations for an attack that would commence at first light. As dawn approached and the eastern sky began to show the first hints of colour, engines roared to life across multiple airfields in a carefully orchestrated sequence that would bring dozens of aircraft into the air and form them into the attack formations that had been rehearsed during training. One after another, the heavily laden Mitchells lumbered down runways of packed dirt, their engines straining against the weight of bombs and ammunition, their wings flexing under loads they had never been designed to carry, but which modification and necessity had made routine. Dust rose in massive clouds that caught the early morning light, creating an almost theatrical effect as aircraft lifted off and began climbing to their assigned altitudes, some heading for positions high above the convoy where they would serve as decoys and diversions, others staying low where they would make their wave-top approaches to deliver the killing blows. Behind them, the air bases fell silent except for the wind and the prayers of those who would wait for returning aircraft, counting them as they came back and mourning those empty spaces in the formation that would mark crews lost to the mission. The men aboard those aircraft carried with them more than just bombs and bullets. They carried the weight of innovation and desperation, the accumulated frustration of months watching Japanese forces operate with apparent impunity, the determination to prove that new thinking and new tactics could overcome advantages in numbers and positioning. They knew what waited for them out there across the blue expanse of the Bismarck Sea, knew they would be flying into concentrated defensive fire from crews trained to shoot down aircraft, knew the odds suggested that not all of them would be coming back to those dusty runways. Yet they also knew that what they carried in those modified bomb bays and gun positions represented something the enemy had never faced before, something that might finally shift the balance in a conflict that had seen too many Allied defeats and retreats. The flight toward the target area passed in tense silence, punctuated by radio checks and navigation updates, each mile bringing them closer to the moment when theory would collide with reality and when months of preparation would be tested in the crucible of actual combat. Colonel Nakamura stood on the bridge of his transport as morning light spread across relatively calm waters, reviewing manifests and deployment plans with the methodical attention to detail that had characterized his entire military career. The voyage had proceeded exactly as expected. The weather was improving right on schedule, and all indications suggested they would make their anchorage at Leh without incident sometime in the early afternoon. He had no reason to suspect that across the horizon, shadows were already racing toward his position at speeds that would bring them into visual range within minutes, carrying with them a form of warfare that would render meaningless all the careful defensive preparations his convoy had made. To him and his fellow officers, the morning represented nothing more than the final hours of a routine transit, soon to be followed by the organized chaos of unloading supplies and troops for deployment to the combat zones that needed them desperately. The possibility that those troops would never reach their destination, that the supplies would end up at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea along with the ships carrying them, simply didn't exist in his calculations, because nothing in his experience suggested such an outcome was possible. The approaching aircraft maintained strict radio silence as they closed the distance to their target, navigation accomplished through dead reckoning and the occasional glimpse of landmarks below that confirmed their position and heading. Pilots scanned the horizon with increasing intensity, knowing that at the speeds they were traveling, the convoy would appear suddenly rather than gradually, emerging from the haze in a matter of seconds that would leave little time to adjust formations or reconsider approaches. The modified Mitchells flew in elements carefully spaced to allow each aircraft to make its attack run without interfering with others in the formation, a delicate balance between mutual support and maintaining enough separation to prevent mid-air collisions during the chaos of the actual attack. Behind them, higher-flying bombers were also converging on the same patch of ocean, their role to create confusion and force the defending destroyers to split their attention between threats at multiple altitudes, preventing them from concentrating their fire on the low-level attackers who represented the real danger. At precisely 10:15 in the morning, the peaceful routine aboard the Japanese convoy was shattered by alarm sirens wailing their warnings across decks and through interior spaces. Radar operators aboard the destroyers called out bearings with voices that carried undertones of confusion because what their screens were showing didn't match the expected profile of high-altitude bomber formations. The contacts were too low, too fast, approaching at altitudes that seemed suicidal for aircraft attempting to attack defended ships. Sailors rushed to battle stations with the practiced efficiency of countless drills, manning weapons and preparing ammunition, confident that whatever was approaching would be dealt with according to established procedures. Officers on bridge wings raised binoculars to scan the horizon, searching for visual confirmation of what their radar was telling them, and what they saw in those final moments before the attack commenced was something that defied their understanding of how air attacks were conducted. The first aircraft to arrive weren't the modified Mitchells at all, but Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters, twin-engine fighters that came screaming in at wave-top height with their cannons already firing, creating streams of tracers that reached out across the water like fingers of death searching for targets. These aircraft weren't attempting to sink ships. Their mission was far more specific and tactical, to suppress the anti-aircraft defences by killing the gunners before they could bring their weapons into effective action, to create the conditions that would allow the following bombers to make their attacks with reduced interference. The Beaufighters tore across the convoy at breathtaking speed, their cannons hammering out shells that chewed through deck plating and flesh with equal indifference, cutting down sailors before they could even fully comprehend what was attacking them. Wooden structures splintered into clouds of fragments, metal bent and tore under the impact of explosive shells, and men who seconds earlier had been confident in their safety found themselves dying in ways they had never imagined possible. Then came the sound that would haunt Japanese survivors for the rest of their lives, the deep roar of multiple engines being pushed to maximum power, combined with the characteristic buzzsaw noise of 8 heavy machine guns firing simultaneously. The modified B-25s arrived like avenging spirits, their solid metal noses pointed directly at their targets, every weapon firing in a continuous stream that seemed to connect the aircraft to the ships with visible lines of tracer fire. At 500 yards, the effect was stunning. At 300 yards, it was devastating, and by the time these aircraft released their bombs at what seemed like point-blank range, the decks they were attacking had already been swept clean of anything resembling organized resistance. The bombs themselves, released with the precision that months of practice had instilled, behaved exactly as planned, skipping across the wave tops once, twice, sometimes 3 times before slamming into hulls at or below the waterline where their explosions could do maximum damage to the structural integrity of the target vessels. The Yomaru, one of the primary transports in the convoy, received the attention of Major Ed Lana's aircraft in an attack run that would later be analysed and studied as a textbook example of the new tactics. Lana brought his Mitchell in at full throttle, every gun in his nose firing from maximum range to create suppressive fire that forced defending gunners to take cover rather than man their weapons. The solid stream of projectiles walked across the transport's superstructure, shattering glass, punching through thin metal plating, creating chaos and destruction that prevented any organized response to the attack. At the optimal release point, calculated through countless practice runs, the bomber's weapons officer toggled the bomb release and felt the aircraft surge upward slightly as the weight came off the wings. The weapon fell away cleanly, struck the water at exactly the right angle, bounced as designed, and impacted the hull of the Yomaru just above the waterline with an explosion that tore open compartments and sent seawater flooding into spaces that had never been designed to resist such damage. Within minutes that stretched into an eternity for those trapped below decks, the transport began to list heavily as flooding spread through compromised bulkheads, her death throes accompanied by the screams of soldiers trapped in dark holds filling rapidly with water that offered no escape. Behind Lana came 11 more Mitchells, each one repeating the deadly sequence with variations dictated by the specific geometry of their individual attack runs, and within minutes the convoy that had steamed so confidently toward its destination was transformed into a scene of utter carnage. Lieutenant Ralph Deloe lined up his aircraft on the Kios Maru itself, the very vessel carrying Colonel Nakamura and his staff, bringing his bomber in so low that the propeller wash kicked up spray from the wave tops in curtains of mist that partially obscured his forward view. The 8 guns in his nose opened up with a roar that drowned out even the sound of the engines, creating a cone of fire that swept across the transport's deck like an invisible scythe, cutting down everything in its path. Nakamura felt the deck shudder beneath his feet as machine gun rounds tore through his ship, heard the screams of men dying in spaces throughout the vessel, and then felt the world come apart as a bomb penetrated deep into the engineering spaces before detonating in an explosion that ruptured steam lines and killed everyone in the vicinity instantly. The Kios Maru staggered like a wounded animal, her forward momentum dying away as destroyed machinery could no longer drive her propellers, leaving her dead in the water and vulnerable to follow-up attacks that would ensure her destruction. Across the convoy, similar scenes of devastation multiplied with terrifying speed as the modified bombers worked through their target list with mechanical efficiency. The Nojima Maru took 3 direct hits in rapid succession, each bomb penetrating her hull and detonating inside spaces packed with troops and equipment, tearing her apart from within until her structure could no longer maintain integrity, and she broke in half with a shriek of tortured metal. The Kembu Maru, carrying aviation fuel in addition to her other cargo, erupted into a pillar of flame when a bomb ruptured her fuel tanks, creating an inferno so intense that sailors on nearby ships could feel the heat across hundreds of yards of open water. Explosions rippled through the convoy as bombs found their marks with a frequency that conventional high-altitude attacks had never achieved, each detonation opening holes in hulls that let the sea pour in with relentless pressure, dragging ships down into depths that would become their final resting places. The destroyer Asashio, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Sato, attempted to defend against the onslaught with a courage that bordered on desperation, her guns tracking targets that moved too fast and flew too low for effective engagement. Sato shouted orders that were lost in the cacophony of explosions and gunfire, trying to coordinate a defense against an attack that violated every assumption his training had instilled in him. His anti-aircraft weapons, designed to engage bombers at altitude where their slower speeds and predictable flight paths made them vulnerable, simply couldn't track aircraft screaming past at 300 miles per hour barely 50 feet above the ocean surface. By the time a gun crew could orient their weapon toward a target, that target had already flashed past and was gone, replaced by another bomber approaching from a different angle that required the gun to be completely reoriented for even a chance at effective fire. The frustration of watching ships under his protection torn apart while his weapons remained largely ineffective drove Sato to increasingly desperate measures, including an attempt to actually ram one of the attacking aircraft by turning his destroyer directly into its flight path. The American pilot targeted by this kamikaze-like maneuver saw the destroyer turning toward him at the last possible moment and yanked his control column back with enough force to make his aircraft's structure groan in protest, pulling up in a climb so steep that he cleared the destroyer's mast by less than 10 feet, according to observers. As his bomber passed over the Japanese warship, his dorsal gunner, who had been tracking the destroyer's bridge through his sights, opened fire with a long burst that swept across the exposed command positions, killing officers and crew members where they stood and leaving the ship momentarily without effective control. The destroyer veered wildly off course, flames erupting from her superstructure as the damage from that single burst of gunfire combined with hits from other attacking aircraft to turn her into another casualty of the battle. For the Japanese sailors and soldiers caught in this maelstrom, the experience transcended normal combat and entered the realm of pure nightmare. Survivors would later struggle to find words adequate to describe what they had witnessed, often settling on descriptions that invoked mythological creatures or supernatural phenomena, because ordinary military terminology seemed insufficient to capture the reality of aircraft that seemed to breathe fire, that swept across the waves like dragons of legend, that delivered death with a precision and ferocity that left no room for survival. The careful formation discipline that Japanese doctrine emphasized simply disintegrated as individual ships began taking independent evasive action, turning frantically in attempts to avoid incoming bombers, sometimes colliding with other vessels in the convoy as captains prioritized immediate survival over maintaining position. Some ships lost propulsion as boilers were ruptured by bomb hits, leaving them wallowing helplessly in the water as follow-up attacks finished what the first waves had begun. Others burned furiously as fires spread through compartments and consumed everything flammable, creating pillars of smoke that rose thousands of feet into the clear morning air. High above this scene of devastation, B-17 flying fortresses added their weight to the attack, dropping bombs from altitude that forced the defending destroyers to maintain anti-aircraft fire against high-level threats, while the modified Mitchells continued their work at wave-top height. This vertical separation of attacking aircraft created an impossible situation for the Japanese defenders, who could neither concentrate their fire on a single threat nor effectively engage targets at such disparate altitudes simultaneously. The convoy found itself caught in a three-dimensional kill zone where threats came from every direction and every height, where there was no safe position and no effective defensive formation, where the only options were to die quickly or die slowly, but where survival was not among the available choices. By noon, the transformation of the convoy from a confident formation into a scattered graveyard of burning wrecks was essentially complete. The Teomaru had vanished beneath the waves, taking most of her complement with her into the depths. The Kios Maru, Nakamura's command, was listing so heavily that her decks were awash, seawater pouring through massive holes torn in her hull by multiple bomb hits, her end clearly only minutes away. The Nojima Maru existed only as floating wreckage, her broken halves drifting apart as the last trapped survivors screamed for help that would never come. The Kembu Maru had become a funeral pyre, flames consuming everything as ammunition stores detonated in secondary explosions that sent debris arcing high into the air. The air itself had thickened with smoke and the smell of burning oil, creating a pall that reduced visibility and turned the beautiful morning into something dark and hellish. What followed in the hours after the main attack represents one of the most controversial aspects of the battle, a phase that would haunt some of the participating air crew for the rest of their lives, yet which was conducted under orders that reflected the brutal logic of total war. As ships sank and survivors found themselves struggling in water blackened by oil and debris, clinging to wreckage and calling out for rescue, Allied aircraft returned to strafe these men in the water. The orders were clear and left no room for interpretation. No survivors were to be permitted to reach land where they might reinforce Japanese positions and continue the fight. Pilots who had to this point felt the adrenaline rush of combat success now found themselves in the position of shooting at defenseless men, watching tracers tear into clusters of survivors who raised their hands not in surrender but in futile gestures pleading for mercy that would not be granted. Some of the air crews would later record their feelings about this phase of the battle in diaries and letters, their words carrying the weight of guilt and trauma that came from participation in what felt less like combat and more like execution. The logic behind these orders was cold but undeniable in the context of a war where every enemy soldier who reached the battlefield represented Allied casualties to come, where mercy shown today would be repaid in blood tomorrow. Every man pulled from the water and successfully evacuated to Japanese-held territory was a soldier who would fight again, who would man defensive positions or participate in counterattacks that would kill Americans and Australians. Yet the execution of these orders required the participating aircrew to do something that violated fundamental human instincts about the treatment of helpless enemies, creating psychological scars that would persist long after the physical wounds of war had healed. Some pilots confessed they could never forget the sight of men in the water flinching away from approaching aircraft, could never forget the knowledge that the last thing many of these sailors saw was the flash of muzzles firing the rounds that would end their lives. Colonel Nakamura found himself among the survivors who made it into the water as the Chios Maru finally gave up her fight against the sea and slipped beneath the surface with a final groan of collapsing bulkheads and escaping air. He clung to a piece of debris that had once been part of his ship's superstructure, surrounded by the floating dead and the few living who had managed to escape the sinking vessel, watching as American bombers wheeled overhead like predatory birds, deciding which targets merited their attention. Around him stretched a scene of devastation so complete that it seemed impossible to comprehend. Where 8 proud transport ships had steamed that morning, there was now only wreckage and oil slicks. Where thousands of soldiers had stood ready to reinforce their comrades, there were now only bodies drifting in the swell. He looked up at those circling aircraft and understood in that moment that something fundamental had changed in the nature of warfare, that the old assumptions about naval power and the limitations of air power had been proven catastrophically wrong, that the empire he had served was facing challenges it might not be able to overcome. When the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the Bismarck Sea had been transformed into a maritime cemetery of unprecedented scale. All 8 transports rested on the bottom, their holds still full of supplies and equipment that would never reach their intended destinations, their decks still crowded with the bodies of soldiers who had died without ever seeing the enemy who killed them. 4 destroyers had joined them in the depths. Their protective mission failed so completely that their presence had made essentially no difference to the outcome. Out of nearly 7,000 men who had embarked on this voyage with confidence in their mission and their safety, fewer than 1,300 would eventually reach land, and many of those would be so traumatized by the experience that their value as soldiers would be questionable. The Allied losses amounted to a handful of aircraft and their crews, a disparity so extreme that it seemed to defy the normal calculus of military exchanges. When word of the battle reached commanders on both sides, the reactions were dramatically different. Japanese headquarters received the reports with something approaching disbelief, unwilling to accept that an entire convoy could have been annihilated so completely by aircraft, demanding verification and additional details that only confirmed the initial reports of total disaster. The news travelled up the chain of command until it reached the Emperor himself, who was informed that Japan had suffered a defeat that called into question the entire strategy of mobile reinforcement across the Pacific. For a military culture that had built its Pacific strategy on the assumption that properly escorted convoys could move relatively freely across the seas they had controlled since the war's early days, the implications were staggering. From this point forward, the movement of troops and supplies would become exponentially more difficult, forced into routes and methods that sacrificed efficiency for even the hope of survival. For the Allies, news of the victory was received with celebrations that were tempered by the knowledge of what the success had cost in terms of the moral compromises required to achieve it. Newspapers across America and Australia proclaimed the battle as a turning point, evidence that the tide was shifting in the Pacific theatre, proof that American ingenuity and courage were finding ways to overcome the advantages Japan had seized in the war's early months. To the men who had flown the missions, however, the victory carried a weight that made celebration feel inappropriate, memories of what they had done and seen preventing them from fully embracing the triumph that others wanted to assign to their actions. Some struggled with their participation in the strafing of survivors, unable to reconcile the necessity of those orders with their personal sense of right and wrong. Others simply felt exhausted, drained by the intensity of combat conducted at such close range where mistakes would have been immediately fatal. The strategic consequences of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea rippled outward through both military organizations in ways that would shape the remainder of the Pacific campaign. Japanese planners, confronted with incontrovertible evidence that large-scale convoy operations were no longer viable in the face of Allied air power, were forced to completely rethink their logistics strategy. The wide-ranging empire that had seemed so impressive on maps suddenly became a massive liability, with garrison after garrison stranded on distant islands with no reliable means of resupply or reinforcement. Submarines and fast destroyers running supplies at night became the only options, methods that sacrificed capacity for stealth and still carried enormous risks. The garrison at Leh, which had been expecting the reinforcements carried by the destroyed convoy, would never receive them, beginning a slow process of deterioration that would eventually lead to its loss and the loss of New Guinea as a Japanese-held territory. For Allied forces, the battle validated the entire approach of innovation over tradition, proving that conventional wisdom about the limitations of various weapons systems could be overcome through creative thinking and willingness to accept risks. The 8-gun nose modification that had been born in field workshops from the grief and determination of men like Paul Gunn became standard equipment, with factories back in the United States beginning to produce similar configurations in recognition of their proven effectiveness. Skip bombing evolved from an experimental technique into established doctrine, with training programs developed to teach new crews the skills that had been learned through trial and error by the pioneers of the method. The very concept of what aircraft could accomplish against naval targets was fundamentally rewritten, with planners beginning to consider how air power might be leveraged against even the largest warships, not just transports and their escorts. The psychological impact on Japanese naval forces was perhaps as significant as the material losses, creating a pervasive atmosphere of fear around the prospect of air attacks that would affect operations for the remainder of the war. Stories of the flying destroyers spread through the ranks, growing more terrifying with each retelling, creating an almost superstitious dread of the modified Mitchells that made rational defense difficult when actual attacks materialized. Sailors who had previously been confident in their training and equipment now flinched at every aircraft sighting, convinced that the next attack might employ the same devastating tactics that had destroyed the Bismarck Sea convoy. This erosion of confidence made convoy operations even more difficult as captains made increasingly defensive decisions, scattering formations at the first sign of air contacts and making movement across contested waters slower and more hazardous even when attacks didn't materialize. The battle entered military history as a case study in how technological innovation combined with tactical creativity could overcome seemingly overwhelming defensive advantages, taught in war colleges and analyzed by strategists who recognized that the lessons extended far beyond the specific circumstances of March 1943. The transformation of the B-25 Mitchell from a conventional medium bomber into a devastating anti-shipping weapon became a symbol of American adaptability and industrial capacity to modify equipment to meet battlefield requirements. The fact that these modifications had been largely improvised in field workshops rather than developed through formal programs highlighted the value of empowering personnel closest to actual combat to experiment with solutions to the problems they encountered directly. Paul Gunn, the grief-stricken former naval aviator whose personal tragedy had driven him to create the weapons that destroyed the convoy, would continue his work throughout the remainder of the war, applying the same innovative thinking to other challenges as they emerged. His story became part of the mythology of the Pacific Theater, an example of how individual determination and skill could influence the course of battles and campaigns. The families he had lost to Japanese occupation remained in captivity, their fate uncertain, but the vengeance he had taken against enemy forces represented a form of personal warfare that resonated with many who had suffered similar losses in the early disasters of the Pacific conflict. Major William Benn and the crews of the 63rd Bombardment Squadron, who had pioneered skip bombing techniques, found themselves in demand as instructors and advisors, their practical experience valued far more highly than any amount of theoretical knowledge about attack methods. The tactics they had developed through dangerous experimentation became the foundation for training programs that would prepare future generations of aircrew to conduct similar missions, spreading the knowledge that had been bought with such risk across the entire organization. The squadron itself would continue operations throughout the Pacific campaign, their expertise in low-level attack making them a valuable asset for missions requiring precision that conventional bombing simply couldn't deliver. The wreckage of the convoy remained on the floor of the Bismarck Sea, a permanent memorial to the men who had died there and a testament to the transformative power of innovation in warfare. Divers who later explored the sites found the transports largely intact despite the damage that had sent them to the bottom, their holds still packed with equipment and supplies that represented a massive investment of resources that Japan could ill afford to lose. The destroyers that had failed in their protective mission lay scattered around the convoy's final position, their guns still trained skyward in frozen testimony to their futile attempts to defend against an attack that came from angles and employed methods they had never been designed to counter. Colonel Nakamura survived his ordeal in the water and eventually reached Japanese-held territory after days of drifting on debris, one of the fortunate few who managed to escape both the immediate devastation of the attack and the follow-up strafing that had killed so many of his fellow survivors. His account of the battle, recorded in Japanese military documents, provided a perspective from the receiving end of the new tactics that helped Allied intelligence understand the psychological impact their methods were having on enemy forces. He described the attack as unlike anything he had encountered in his military career, comparing the modified Mitchells to mythological creatures and expressing his conviction that the confidence Japan had held about the security of its convoy routes had been shattered forever by what he had witnessed. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as one of those pivotal moments where warfare underwent a fundamental transformation, where old assumptions gave way to new realities in a matter of hours rather than years. The dominance that battleships and surface fleets had exercised over the oceans since naval warfare began was revealed to be conditional, dependent on those ships being able to operate beyond the reach of aircraft that possessed both the weapons and tactics necessary to engage them effectively. The clear skies that had opened over the Bismarck Sea on March 3, 1943, had allowed not just an attack to proceed, but a demonstration that would echo through the remainder of the war and beyond, proving that innovation and determination could overcome tradition and numerical superiority. that the side willing to abandon comfortable doctrine in favour of dangerous experimentation might seize advantages that doctrine alone could never provide.